premise of a text such as a book, film, or screenplay is the initial state of affairs that drives the plot. In this lesson, we will learn how to take a story seed and develop it into an adventure premise. In tabletop RPGs, a premise should answer the following questions: who's involved? What was the inciting incident? What is the ongoing conflict? And how did the status quo change? We're going to break down and explain each of these questions in terms, but first, let's look at an example for a complete premise. The villagers of Beginnersville chop down a tree that is sacred to the nearby dryads, causing them to become agitated and desire vengeance. The dryads are now kidnapping people in response. Let's make sure we answered all the questions. So to answer who is involved, we have the villagers and the dryads. The inciting incident was the villagers cutting down the sacred tree. The ongoing conflict is that the dryads want revenge for it. Finally, we know how the status quo changed. The dryads began kidnapping children, something they have never done before. A premise is meant to be short, so we can keep it in mind when developing our plot. It's not something you will show to your players, so don't worry if it doesn't feel very polished when you start. It's only meant to help you capture the idea that jumpstarts your plot. If it does that, it has achieved its purpose. Let's break down the 4 questions, starting with who's involved. Here we want to figure out our participants. Your story seed may already point out a few factions or NPCs that can be involved in the adventure premise, but if it doesn't, now is the time to figure them out. If you already started world building, you may have a few factions to choose from. Using members of these factions as participants in your premise is a great opportunity to introduce them to your players. If you don't have a specific faction to feature, try to come up with a few obvious participants that relate to your story seed. For example, if you have a legendary artifact you want your characters to find in a dungeon, ask yourself, what is the nature of this artifact? How was it made? Who else wants it? How did it get into the dungeon? As you begin to answer these questions, take note of the people and factions that arise. They are the participants of your premise. The player's characters may or may not participate in your adventure's premise. That's because the premise often happens before the adventurers are needed. They simply arrive into a difficult situations and have to navigate it from there. On the other hand, if the story seed we have is tied to one of the characters' backstories or is a consequence of a previous choice they made, the characters would be considered participants in the premise. The next question we want to answer is, what was the inciting incident? In adventure design, the inciting incident is the event that fuels the conflict between the participants. It is the turning point where things begin to escalate. So what sort of event can create that kind of tension between our participants? Well, understanding our participants will help us determine that. We discussed the idea of factions in the world building chapter. They are the movers and shakers of our setting, and if we design them correctly, we know what their motivations are. Now we can ask ourselves how the motivations and methods of different participants will breed tension between them. What does each participant want? Why can't they all get it? What is the relationship between them? What could one of them do to aggravate the others? If we find it difficult to come up with an inciting incident, we should try to develop our factions further, or bring in new ones. Once we have our inciting incident, we can use it to ask, what is the ongoing conflict? Conflict moves the story. It is the source of all narrative threads. If the inciting incident was the event that kicked off tension between the participants, the conflict is what drives them to act afterwards. It dictates their reactions and inspired change in the setting. Let's take a look at our example again. The villagers of Beginnersville chop down a tree that is sacred to the nearby dryads, causing them to become agitated and desire vengeance. The inciting incident is the villagers chopping down a tree, and the ongoing conflict is that the dryads desire vengeance against the villagers. This is the driving force for the dryads' actions, and the reason they started kidnapping children. After we have our participants, inciting incident, and ongoing conflict, we can move on to answer the last question. How did the status quo change? In literature, the status quo is the current state of affairs, the combination of circumstances within a society or group at a particular point in time. In tabletop RPGs, the status quo is defined by our setting. Remember this? We discussed the difference between world and setting in the world building chapter. Answering how the status quo changes is almost equivalent to answering how our setting expands within our world. Many things could happen after the inciting incident. Think about how the world reacts to the inciting incident and introduce new elements if necessary. The inciting incident can kickstart a chain of events that involve multiple factions and locations. Each of these becomes a part of your setting as it enters your game's center of attention. Don't hesitate to create new elements if you think they will create a more interesting story. But try not to lose focus on the initial conflict. If you find it difficult to repeat the premise in your head, you probably went too far. As you develop the premise and expand the setting, think about when and where the player characters get involved. This is one of the reasons we expand the setting. We want to create an easy way for the players to explore the situation we've created. Maybe one of the participants knows the player characters and sends for them. Maybe the player characters just happen to cross the town where everything is happening. Whatever it is, once you find the point where the player characters get involved, stop developing. This is where the story becomes a collaboration. A good practical tool is to reuse elements you have already established in your world to make the premise more compelling. For example, if our world has a faction of holy paladins, and we've created a conflict that involves demons, it's very possible that we want to tie the paladins into the premise, especially if the players have already met them. Even if we don't tie them in directly, they can be used to hook the player characters into the plot, or as possible allies to solve the conflict later on. Alright, let's practice what we've learned. Open the Chapter 4 worksheet and find the premise section. Practice identifying the premise of an existing story. If possible, you should use the same fictional story you've used on your world-building worksheet. Your goal is to identify the series of events that led to the involvement of the characters with the plot. In the next lesson, we'll learn how to bring the characters into the plot with a well-placed hook. See you there!